Hey, welcome once again to another critique session on the art tutor. Today we'll be looking at a still life composition entitled Bake and Saltfish. For those of you who are familiar with this particular one, I guess you're starting to salivate. So as always, students are encouraged to submit their work in 3 different stages. So that's the first stage. This is the second stage, and here is the final stage. And of course, we always focus on the final stage, and we're going to take a look at how successful this piece was based on how the student would have utilized the fundamentals of still life painting. So here we go. Now, when you look at the composition, of course, we can see. Let me zoom in to see what's happening there. We can see the bake and the saltfish. That's the bake. 2 bakes, and this is the saltfish. Placed in a plate on a table with drape. From a composition point of view, to me, it's just too centered. If we draw a dividing axis line down here, you get a sense of what I'm talking about. And the question I would ask this particular student, if you were to take away a little bit from your let's say if you would have done this, and I'm gonna if we look at something like that, from a compositional standpoint, how much does that add or take away from your composition? You bring back the original, or if you would have done something like this, how much that would have added or taken away from your composition? And I'm only doing this to show you some of the thought process that you should be going through, especially in your initial construction stage. Play around with sketches. When I bring that up there, you see what is happening there? All of a sudden, your composition takes on a different dynamics because of a few simple changes in terms of the focus. So one of the things that I would advise you in future, when you're working on your initial sketches, and I'm not suggesting that you didn't do this, but I'm giving the advice, do different examples of the composition in terms of what goes where and what should be in focus before you settle. Because for me, when we would have looked at those options by just cropping, and even if we do this and we bring that down a little bit more, and you see the beauty about using these photo editors is that when you click on that, we get to see the grids for the rule of thirds and how it comes into play in the composition. You can draw this on your paper and make that decision. Because if you were to shift that up, or let's say we leave that there and we bring this across as we would have done just now, right away you see the dynamics of the composition start to change. And since the topic is bake and saltfish, you want your focus to be on the bake and the saltfish. And by looking at the way you would have put together your composition, see how more interesting that is? So I deliberately use the editor, the photo editor here in the cropping system. I deliberately use the editor and the cropping tool here to show you some of the possibilities that you could have explored as it relates to composition. Because personally, you could have gotten a lot more out of the composition by having it so centered and so symmetrically balanced. And that's one of the reasons why we would have spent time talking about the rule of thirds, and I would have sent you so many references so that you could have read up and understand some of the concepts in terms of how you compose things. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. It's just very important. And you can take a simple subject matter, and based on how you organize it, how you compose it, can make a big difference in terms of how it comes over to the viewers. Okay, so from a compositional point of view, that's something I would urge you to spend a little more time in the future thinking about and exploring before you settle for one particular composition. The other thing that I want to look at is the representation of space in the composition. And this is always important whenever you're dealing with things like landscape and still life composition. Creating that illusion or representing space is very important. Okay? So when we look at your composition, this here is going to be the foreground, which is the front section of the cloth. And by looking at it, if that is the foreground, the bacon and the saltfish is in the middle ground, and then you have the background here, which is the back of the wall. That's part of your composition. But when we look at the way you would have treat the colors that suggest the tablecloth is falling off the edge of the table here, don't you think that if you would take down this value a little bit more, make it a little darker, it would have allowed this part of the fabric, which you're suggesting based on how you paint it, which you're suggesting that there's more light in this area. Don't you think by making this area a little stronger, not necessarily straight across, but definitely in the areas like here and here, don't you think it would have added a little bit more to creating that sense of that fold that goes from this edge to represent the front of the table and the top of the table? It's a thought. The other thing that we could look at too is the way you would have utilized your colors for the bake and the saltfish. I'm assuming this green here is the salad, and these here are chunks of tomato. That's what I'm assuming based on how it's been treated. And I'm saying chunks, but when I look at yours, it's kind of flat. You see that? So it's almost like red squares. This one here, you can clearly see you would have made the attempt to show that three-dimensional quality or that chunk that you get when you cut tomatoes up. And as I zoom in, I can see that you are making an attempt here and maybe there. But of course, it wasn't convincing enough. So I'm thinking that is something that you could have done. You could have spent a little more time on. Because remember, every brush stroke, every value that you put in your composition is going to say something about the nature of the objects that you are working on or that are a part of your composition. And for me, you could have done a little bit more with these chunks of tomato that you would have had there. And if the light is affecting everything else, the light is also going to affect those chunks of tomatoes. Because by treating it this way, it almost appears as though it's a decoration on the plate, rather than, well, I'm assuming it's a chunk of tomato. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, because when I look at it, that's what I'm thinking, because the plate look white, and all the other stuff that you have there seems to be suggesting salad. So the chunks of the tomato in terms of its shape and its three-dimensional quality is going to be different from that of the lettuce, which is a leaf. And this has more volume than the lettuce. And I needed to see that in the way you would have treat your colors. So when you're painting, these are things that you have to pay keen attention to. Because when your work is analyzed, these are the kind of things I'm going to be looking for. Same thing goes with the portion of the saltfish that's here. I am not getting the sense of three-dimensionality in the saltfish, and I'm going to zoom out because one of the reasons I'm going to zoom out a little bit is because I want you to see that you're suggesting, based on the dark and the cast shadow here and the darkness here on these two bake, you're saying to me that the light is coming from the left side. So if the light is coming from the left side, this portion of the saltfish is going to go up and it's going to come down. And if it's going to go up and it's going to come down because it's going to be in like a monk, it means that somewhere along the way you're going to have a stronger area of light and a very prominent or an obvious area of darkness. And in your case, because you're saying the light is coming from the right side, from the left side, that darkness is going to be on this side. And then to the bottom of the saltfish, if you had added some the cast shadow in this area here, it would have done so much all on it here. It would have done so much for assisting you to represent the true nature of what is happening when you place saltfish in a plate on top of lettuce. And again, I'm assuming it's lettuce, and it don't look like decoration to me in the plate. So I'm assuming it's lettuce. When you look at the way you would have done, you would have represented your shadows on the bake and the dark areas. It's the same thing. This bake is an individual bake, and when it meets there, I should have been able to see something a little more pronounced happening there. And I'm not getting that. And underneath here, because this one obviously is elevated a little bit because it's resting on the side of this one. Underneath here, the cast shadow should have been a little more defined, and it could have done a whole lot to help to represent this bake in a better way. Your lighted areas, and this here look like the float bake, which means that the surface is going to be oily. And if the surface is going to be oily, when light strike the surface, the direct areas where light strike the surface, you're going to have some more stronger areas of light, and I'm not seeing that in these two. So that's something that you're going to need to double check. If you took a photograph, go back and look at your photograph, you're going to see exactly what I'm saying, because once there's light, the oil on the surface of this float bake is going to cause it to shine a little bit more, right? Looking at the way you would have treated the plate, the darkness or the cast shadow around is too similar. This area is closest to the source of light. This area is closest to us in terms of where it is. So therefore the shadow needs to be the cast shadow needs to be a little more pronounced. And maybe as you go away, it gets a little thing. But when we're coming around here, look, it almost seems as though it's like an outline, because you can follow that and you're seeing the same thing here. And that shouldn't be, because the plate, based on where the light is coming from, and based on how you would have painted it, is suggesting it's coming from the left. So therefore, most of the cast shadow is going to be in front and on this side, going this way. And the shadow often takes the form of the object that is casting it, and the shadow is going to be elongated to an extent unless it's directly above. And therefore you need to pay attention to that. So you're going to need to go back and look at that. And the reason why I'm going through this in such details is because when you're painting, these are things that you have to be deliberately looking for, because these things will make the composition stand out. And if you take them for granted, it's going to affect the finished composition. From a color theory point of view, you could have done a whole lot with reflective lights. And this is what I mean when I say that. The bake is on lettuce. And because of the proximity of the lettuce to the bake, the lettuce is gonna the green from the lettuce is gonna bounce off on the bake in this area. Same thing here, and vice versa. The brown from the bake, some of that brown is gonna bounce off on the lettuce, because there's a juxtaposition. There's a relationship between the lettuce and the bake in terms of its close proximity. Same thing with the saltfish. You should have some little accents of greens there to help to unify the composition, rather than make it seem as though you just cut out a thing of the bake and you put it in there, and you cut out another shape and you put it in there. These objects are within an environment, and the colors and the lights form an integral part of influencing these objects in the composition. You're dealing with a bake, so I needed to see some more yellow. I'm seeing hints of that here. But knowing float bake, you should have had some more yellow browns and some more red browns, where you can actually see that coming through in the way you would have blend your colors. So please ensure that you go back and you look at it from that point of view, because you have to pay attention to colors and how you're using colors. Otherwise, your stuff going to just look like a photograph. And remember, we're painting here. And the reason why we would have talked about color theory and information was shared with you about color theory is for you to understand things like this, so that when you start painting now, you take that information and you apply it to your work. When we look at the background, not bad, very simplistic. You just draw some line. Usually one of the things I would often say to students, you don't want your lines to become too predictable. So sometimes you could have messed around with your thickness and your light and dark, because what are they representing? Are they representing the grooves in the wall from the groove and tongue board, or is just a decoration? So you have to think about those things when you're working these things here. The fabric itself, again, because of perspective, you can clearly see that this area should have been whiter because it's closest to you. And if this were whiter and it had been stronger, then all of this would have been able to recede, because as it is right now, this here is too strong for its position. That's the background basically. The distance from here to here takes some traveling. Your plate might be about 8 inches or 6 inches, and then you got another 2 or 3 inches before you get to the end of the fabric. We need to see that based on how you use your colors. And that's one of the reasons why, by not making the highlight or the light area in this part of the fabric stronger, you would have lost some of that sense of distance or perspective from that point of view, based on how you would have used your colors. Right? The same thing can be said for your lettuce. When we look at the lettuce in detail, those lettuce, because they're strips, that's how you're representing them. And you would have made some good attempt here, you see? You show shadow there, you show shadow there. Similarly, something should have been happening underneath there. After you have that strong light there, a little bit of shadow could have gone there. That would have created a different dynamic. The fact that the saltfish is resting on top of this lettuce here is going to have a cast shadow underneath there, somewhere, similarly here. So when it comes to the way you would have treated your shadows, you didn't do a good job at that, and that really take away from the quality of your composition. Remember, when you're painting, this is something I always say. 3 basic tones to start with: your areas of light, your areas of dark, your areas of shadows. And whenever you're setting up your still life composition, and that's why I would have sent the videos showing you all of these things, you have to make a concerted effort to control the source and the direction of your light. Because when you do that, you put yourself in a position now to be able to identify clearly where your light is coming from, so it doesn't have to be a guessing game when persons are looking at your work, and you know clearly where your darks and your shadows are going to be. But as it is right now, when I look at this composition, there's a lot of inconsistency with the way you would have represented the effects of light on the composition. And for me, that it could be one of 2 things. Number 1, you didn't pay attention to it in a very detailed way. Or 2, when you set up your composition, you did not take the time to use a dedicated source of light that you would have controlled in your composition. And I know not everyone will have access to those kind of things, but as much as possible, and especially if you're working from a photograph, if you got to go outside on your veranda or your landing or somewhere where there's direct sunlight to take a photograph of your stuff, it might be better off doing that rather than staying inside and you're just using the minimum light that's available to you. So these are all problem solving things that comes up when you're putting together or you're planning your composition. And you have to take these things into consideration, because if you don't, at the end of the day, you produce compositions that reflects less than your ability if you're taking the time to pay attention to certain basic things. And I'm saying to you in this instance, if you had taken the time to pay attention to some of these things that I would have discussed, this composition would have been much stronger. It's a good composition, but it would have been so much stronger if you'd have paid attention to those basic things. Pay attention to space. Understand that in every composition you have foreground, middle ground, background, and the treatment of each one of these has to be different. So if you're saying this is background, this is foreground, this is middle ground, when you start to paint, the values of the colors that you use got to show foreground, middle ground, background. They can't be fighting where you have background color just as strong as foreground color. No, that's not possible. And you're saying, well, okay, light is coming from the right side, but when I'm looking for the consistency with light from bake 1 to bake 2 to saltfish to lettuce to chunks of tomato, I'm not seeing the consistency where you're saying that light is coming from your left side, because you only treat some parts of the composition with that level of detail that is required to show how light is affecting everything that's a part of the composition. I hope you're seeing where I'm coming from. And if you're not putting this kind of thought into your still life composition, then you're selling yourself short. In concluding, I don't want you to feel that by highlighting those points that needs to be corrected and needs to be addressed, that I'm saying the composition is a total failure. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's a good composition, but you would have been able to achieve so much more if you had paid attention to some of those basic things that I would have just highlighted, that you would have missed. And you still have an opportunity to go back and make those adjustments, and then you can compare this particular final composition, and then you photograph the one where you would have made the adjustment, and you're going to see the difference when you add those things that I talk about. The reflective colors, where your green bounce off onto the brown of the bake, where the brown of the bake, some of it bounce off onto the green of the lettuce, where you show the oily nature of the bake, where you have a little more yellows in your mixtures of the browns and some amount of red. And then you look at the way you address your shadows onto the plate, and then ensure that the light area in this fabric that is in front is not the same as as the fabric that's in the background. Address those things, make those corrections, photograph it again, resend it to me, and you'll see the difference. And in fact, you can just take a look at it yourself, and you see the difference in the quality of your composition. I thank you for your time, and I thank you for your submission. And hopefully you'll go through this with an objective outlook. If there's anything that I would have said that is not accurate, feel free to check me in to make that point clear, or to clarify that in the comment section below, and we can have a constructive discussion as we move forward. So I thank you.